In this video, we're going to introduce what is known as the 68, 95, 99.7 rule. Now, this rule applies to normally distributed data, which basically means data that makes this bell curve shape. Now, there are 3 dot points here that basically explain this rule. But if you're new to this rule, these dot points probably won't make much sense to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make up a really basic example and use that to explain the 3 dot points here. So for my example, let's say that you do some sort of an exam in the class. And let's say that the mean mark or the average mark was 60% for that class. And let's say you also calculated the standard deviation, SD for standard deviation, and let's say that that came out to 10%. Now, we mentioned earlier that the peak of your bell curve lines up with your mean of 60%. Now, you'll notice that I have dotted lines that represent different intervals on our bell curve. We're going to have 1, 2, 3 intervals to the right of our mean and 1, 2, 3 intervals to the left of the mean. Now, I mentioned that the standard deviation is 10%. So as I move to the right, I'm going to add on 10% each time. Our first interval will be 70%, our second interval will be 80%, and our third interval will be 90%. I would also like to label my intervals. This was the first interval, so we'll call it +1. Then we have our second interval and our third interval. You may be wondering why we've got the plus out the front. This is because each time we added on 10%. So for the first interval, we added on 10% once, then we added on 10% twice, and then we added on 10% 3 times to the mean. What's going to happen when we move to the left? Well, this time we're going to subtract 10%. So we've got 50%, then 40%, and then finally 30%. When we label these intervals, we're going to have -1, -2, and -3, meaning that we're subtracting 10% each time. So for the first interval, we subtracted 10% once, and then subtracted 10% twice, and then subtracted 10% 3 times from the mean. Now is a good time to start making sense of these 3 dot points here. The first dot point says that 68% of the data lies within 1 standard deviation of the mean. Now, when we say 1 standard deviation, we mean between -1 and +1. Both of these intervals are 1 standard deviation away from the mean. So I'm going to write down that 68% of the data lies between these 2 intervals. So what do we mean by that? Well, basically we're saying that 68% of the students got a mark between 50% and 70% in this particular exam. Let's look at the next dot point. It says that 95% of the data lies within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So we're now looking at the -2 and the +2 intervals. That's because these 2 intervals are 2 standard deviations away from the mean. So according to dot point 2, 95% of the data lies between these 2 intervals, meaning that 95% of the students got a mark in this exam between 40 and 80%. When we look at the third dot point, 99.7% of the data lies within 3 standard deviations of the mean. That means if we look at the +3, which is 3 standard deviations to the right of the mean, and the -3, 99.7% of the students got a mark between these 2 intervals. So almost the whole class got a mark between 30 and 90%. There's only 0.3% left over. That 0.3% might represent a student that got more than 90%, or it might represent a student that got less than 30%. Anyway, that concludes our video introducing the 68, 95, 99.7 rule. Remember to read the description below for links to workbooklets that relate to this video.